Throughout history, one common characteristic of every culture is that there are people within that society who seem to have a special connection with the sacred. And of course, what is called sacred is defined in very many different ways by the world's religions and philosophies. We often call this type of relationship or bond a mystical connection. And we call the person who can experience it a sage or a guru, a shaman, a priest, or something similar. There are, of course, skeptics who suggest that what appears to be a special relationship or a mystical connection is really in the mind of the believer, that in truth there's no such connection. Well, I would be the first to agree that there are certainly some examples of supposed mystical connections that are simply fraudulent. Some people who say they can talk to God or spirits are often out of touch with reality. And there's far too many examples of ministers or supposedly holy people who report these type of conversations for their own particular purposes and often for personal financial gain. There's also examples of human experiences that may appear mystical, but are indeed created in the mind of the believer. All of this said, there's little doubt that mysticism and mystical connections can be very real. Simply put, there's just too many instances of mystics throughout human history, in all cultures, to refute the phenomenon. And mystics oftentimes seem to have many characteristics with other mystics, despite the fact they come from vastly different cultures and religious backgrounds. For thousands of years, the words of mystics have been orally transmitted or written down for all to hear and see and read. And medical science today can actually see that these mystical connections actually change and alter human brain activity. Mysticism, according to historical and psychological definitions, is a direct intuition or experience of the sacred. A mystic is a person who has, to a greater or lesser degree, a direct experience with what they consider to be sacred, however that's defined. In other words, a mystic does not accept their religious faith or commonly held beliefs or practices, not just accepting them, but on what he or she regards as first-hand personal knowledge. They feel it. Mystical experiences often do tend to reflect the doctrines and beliefs of a particular religion, and mystical experiences can often occur with common rituals found in a given religion. A good example of this is the Native American sweat lodge experience. Through elaborate prayers and chants and fasting and meditation in a sweat lodge, which is a kind of a homegrown sauna, Indians claim to reach a oneness with nature and the sacred. Another example of mystical ritual is the famed whirling dervishes of Islamic Sufi tradition found in the Middle East. Through prayer and meditation and literally a whirling dance, Sufi mystics say they are able to attain a level of connection with the sacred that's unavailable to a common believer. By following various religious and meditative rituals, the mystic attains a state of being where they say they're able to apprehend a transcendent reality, sometimes an entity, or a connection with otherness that lies beyond the spatial temporal realm in which we normally live, the here and now, the reality that we perceive every day. The mystic touches another space and place, not connected to our reality. In most cases, a state of being or connection that is achieved creates a kind of bliss or serenity, a kind of peace and unity. Curiously, the state of being that's achieved by the mystic, through their faith and attention to ritual details, is a state similar to the one hoped for by those taking hallucinogenic drugs. But I, for one, don't believe that drugs create a legitimate mystical experience. Researchers tell us that the brain of a person undergoing a mystical experience shows dramatic neural changes, which actually rewire a person's brain, creating a change in how that person perceives the world around them, how they think and feel and behave going forward after such an experience. I find it curious that people who have had a near-death experience often describe these experiences, their feelings, and how they describe the events in a manner that's quite similar to mystical experiences. It's very interesting. It's important to note that although mysticism and deep spirituality are almost completely intertwined, mystics do not necessarily have to have a belief in a god or gods, nor do they have to have a theistic approach to reality at all. Many types of Buddhism, for example, have a mystical tradition, often an elaborate and powerful one. And Buddhism is not a theistic religion, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. I remember talking about this to a minister at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Arlington, Virginia, the congregation where I did my ministerial internship. This minister explained to me that she was a mystical humanist. Although she did not believe in the traditional God of the Bible, she somehow knew that creation was sacred, and she believed that it was possible to connect with the universe in a mystical way through meditation and prayer and ritual. From what she told me, she seemed to have moments of mystical connection every bit as profound as those experienced by Hindu and Buddhist and Christian and Islamic mystics. Mysticism is a puzzling aspect of religion that I find personally fascinating. I mentioned this some weeks ago in another sermon, and I did suggest that Unitarian Universalists can indeed have mystical experiences. I myself can relate to such mystical experiences. There have been moments of epiphany in my life where for a brief instant, doesn't last, I have felt and sensed a oneness with creation, and I have felt a connection with the sacred forces of life, what some would call God. Although I too do not believe in the biblical God, because my definition of the sacred is much more complex and grounded in scientific theory, like quantum theory, which I think touches that God event. My experiences are almost indescribable, but there's no question in my mind as to the reality, nor as to the impact they've always seemed to have on my life when they occur. I would have to say, without the mystical experiences that I have had in my life since I was a child, I would never have become a minister, because religion would never have played such a central role in my life. Without having experienced mystical connections, religion for me would at best have been an intellectual study of human efforts to reach the unknowable. With my inherent cynicism and relentless desire to question and challenge widely held religious beliefs, I might easily have had no sense or appreciation of religion or spirituality at all, which is the case for a lot of people. It's my mystical experiences that have made religion, but more specifically spirituality, quite central to my life. The mystical experiences have greatly influenced me over the years, so much so that I left my career behind, or so I thought, when I was 36 and went to seminary to try to understand what religion and spirituality are all about, and try to understand the meaning and purpose of life. My mystical experiences literally led me to seminary. It's said that some people who study psychology and psychiatry do so because they're trying to understand themselves and their own perceived unusual nature, one way or another. I think the same can be said for at least some people, not all people, who enter seminaries. I found many of my colleagues in all the seminaries of the Graduate Theological Union, where I went to seminary at the UU seminary there, from all numerous religious backgrounds, to be profound people, some of them, not all of them, who had a burning desire to understand their spiritual self in the context of a religious and spiritual backdrop, which in many cases, for them, for most seminarians, was defined through their particular religion. Although I've already noted many mystics, not surprisingly, describe their mystical experiences through the religion they are most familiar with. Mystics who write about or teach the religion through which they experience the sacred often profoundly alter that religion, or they sometimes create a new religion. Some of the Jewish prophets were mystics. That's pretty clear from reading Hebrew scripture, the Tanakh, which is the same thing as the Old Testament. Jesus himself was a Jewish mystic. The Buddha was a mystic. Muhammad was a mystic. In a sense, it is mystics and mystical traditions that give meaning and personal connection to otherwise bland doctrines and creeds and rituals. Jesus, for example, remained a Jew to his dying day. He never once called for the creation of a new religion, never once. Nor did he claim to have some new religious knowledge not previously revealed through his Jewish experience. Jesus did believe he was the Jewish Messiah, but that was the Messiah described in Hebrew scripture. And in the first three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, he never claimed to be God. In John, he claimed to be God. John was written 2.5 generations after his death. And he says he's God in John, but not in the other three. What Jesus did say was that Judaism of his day had become too wrapped around the religious ritual and the religious laws that had become part of the Jewish tradition, which was around Jerusalem when he was alive. It's not that he disavowed these laws, he simply ignored many of them, and he saw them as an impediment to establishing a personal connection with God. It was his mystical spiritual connection that enabled him to speak with authority and believability. Similarly, the Buddha, 500 years before Jesus, did not endeavor to create a new religion in India of 2500 BCE. He simply noted that the Hindu ascetic rituals of the period prevented a person from truly understanding the nature of the universe and the oneness of all things. It was his profound mysticism and his deep sense of the universe around him that led the Buddha to simply yet elegantly describe religious truths, an understanding of the oneness of all things, an understanding that pain and suffering are the result of desire, an understanding that the secret of balance and harmony leads to happiness, and that balance and harmony can only be achieved by the middle path, by living one's life in the middle, between the extremes of overindulgence on the one side and asceticism on the other. And like the great mystics before him, Muhammad sought the sacred through a mystical connection with God, the God that was defined in his time through the Jewish and Christian experience of the 6th century of the Common Era. Muhammad borrowed from Judaism and Christianity. As a young man, Muhammad's mystical experiences were very strong. Muhammad was married to an older woman, Khadijah, who financially supported him and encouraged him to spend time in spiritual contemplation in the cave at Hira, which was in the mountains of Mecca, near Mecca. Like the Buddha and Jesus, the result of Muhammad's retreats and meditations was the creation of a religious following that would alter the history of humankind and set into motion a new world religion that would grow and evolve into the centuries to become the fastest growing religion in the 21st century. It is mystics who give life to religion. It is mystics who alter or create religions, and it is mystics who continue to transform religion. Some years ago, I ran across a book. There were 3 books in the series, Conversations with God. It was bestsellers. Books were written by a man who had reached his late 40s and was feeling really down professionally and personally. He came home late one evening and found himself asking God in a loud voice, "Where are you? What is the meaning of my life? How come you never answer my questions? How come life is so rotten?" Much to his surprise, God began to answer his questions. And on that night, he took out a yellow pad and he wrote down God's answers. For over a year, these conversations continued, and the result was the book series, Conversations with God. Needless to say, I was somewhat skeptical when I listened to the books, and it was a little surprise to me that God's answers seemed to take a decidedly Jewish and Christian perspective since the author was educated in Catholic schools. Still, Conversations with God is an intriguing set of books and well worth listening to or reading. Somehow, some way, I do believe that the author's mystical experience in these conversations was real. Strange, but real. Perhaps the one passage in Conversations that most fascinated me was when the author asked God, why? Why did you create this universe? I listened very carefully for that answer. God's answer? Because I had to experience myself. An interesting idea that's found in keeping, that same idea is found in keeping with other religious traditions. To me, what makes mysticism so difficult to believe is it's easy to fake. And it's easy to identify something as a mystical experience when in fact it's really a psychotic event or something created in the mind. One time I was visiting a friend in Florida. He knew I was a minister, so he asked me if I was aware of the appearance of the Virgin Mary in a nearby office building. I told him I wasn't, so he said, "Would you like to see it?" Well, naturally, I was interested. I want to see the Virgin Mary. Who wouldn't, right? So he drove me to a 3-story glass office building. On the one side of the building was a kind of a rainbow-colored figure that, with a lot of imagination, kind of looked like a human figure. I suspect in-ground sprinklers, which sprayed the bushes and grass around the building, had sprayed chemicals onto the glass, which gave the appearance, again with imagination, of a human figure. Well, that was enough to convince a group of people it was the Virgin Mary, and so they bought the office building and turned it into a shrine. Another instance, in 1993, I remember doing my clinical pastoral internship for ministry in a Washington, D.C. hospital. One day I was at lunch with several other ministry students and the hospital chaplain, who happened to be a very liberal Methodist minister. During the course of the lunch, the minister began laughing about people who speak in tongues, which is really the whole basis of Pentecostal churches. He simply could not understand how anyone could start mumbling gibberish and think that they were having some kind of a personal encounter with God. I quietly agreed with him that it was most unlikely. But much to my amazement and the embarrassment of the minister, 3 or 4 people in our group said they actually regularly spoke in tongues. So the point is, what identifies something as a mystical experience versus something that is mystical in one's mind only? What is that? What is genuinely a mystical experience, or are all spiritual and religious experiences simply real to a person or a group of people? This is a tough question, but it's not one without an answer. First of all, it's not that difficult to identify the phony mystical experiences, those created by people for a particular purpose. And it's not really difficult to identify a psychotic experience because the person claiming the experience is not well grounded in reality. It's also not difficult to dismiss group experiences that create a reality or a belief because of the group's intense belief or desire to believe in something. But if you take a hard look at religious mystics throughout the centuries, you'll find they have several common characteristics. They lack personal motivation for their mystical experiences. Mystics generally do not claim a particular personal authority leading to some gain, financial or otherwise, because of their experiences. nor do they usually claim to know or perceive some hitherto unknown knowledge. What they do generally claim is to see and sense and feel a connection with the sacred, with God or with something they define through their cultural experience and understanding of the world. And they speak about that truth as they understand it. That's what Jane Goodall did in the reading. Mystics generally develop an aura of peace and tranquility, and they're eager to share this with others. Many of the great mystics of the ages are people of love. Although through their life, their work, their teachings, and their writings, they exude love. In fact, it can be said that a mystical connection with the sacred is a connection with love, for love is the glue that binds the fabric of the universe together and is found operant in all its parts. In the words of Walt Whitman, they do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. No one is dissatisfied. No one is demented with the mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived thousands of years ago. Not one is respectable or unhappy over the whole earth. There are sages and gurus and shamans and priests through the ages who are intuitive mystics. Many of them have a special gift and an intuitive connection with the sacred that finds its way into their outlook on the world and into their own writings. Should you want to try to better understand the mystical experience, I urge you to spend time with the mystics who have lived and loved in all the ages of humankind. In learning to understand them, you may find yourself on your own mystical journey to the edge of forever. Peace be with you.